Hello and welcome to the Platte Institute webinar. I'm Adam Weinberg, joined by Sarah Curry and Nicole Fox on the Platte Institute team. Today's discussion is on the impact of agriculture in the COVID-19 crisis. We're fortunate to have for our guests today, Jay Rempe, the Senior Economist at Nebraska Farm Bureau, and Tom Sell, former Deputy Chief of Staff for the House Committee on Agriculture. Both of these gentlemen are going to discuss the national and local impact on agriculture. We're going to start with Tom in just a moment here. I'm going to pitch it over to him, but I want to talk about how the Platte Institute webinar works so that you understand the ground rules of the program. You are able to ask questions throughout the program. If you go down to the toolbar on Zoom, you can check out the Q&A section. Feel free to send our speakers your questions and we'll forward them to them as the program continues. There'll be plenty of time in this hour program where you can get your questions answered, and we welcome you to ask as many as you'd like. Also, if you'd like to check out this program after today's broadcast, you can check it out at platteinstitute.org/podcasts. We'll have a recording there later today, along with slides. Jay's going to have some slides for Nebraska Farm Bureau that we're looking forward to presenting to you. So I'd like now to pitch it over to Tom Sell. He's the former Deputy Chief of Staff for the House Agriculture Committee. Tom, tell us a little bit about yourself, the work that you've done, and now we can talk about the national impact.
Well, thanks, Adam, and thanks, Sarah. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I've had great experiences with Nebraska politicians, and I love the way that as a state, I think you work through issues in a very thoughtful manner, in a very bipartisan manner, in a deep way, thinking about the impacts of policy. And so I think the Platte Institute stands for those values and the way that you do your business, and so I'm just really honored to be here. We have a firm, Sell and Associates, and we've been very involved in ag policy work, ag, rural, and all the things that touches. So whether that's environmental issues, international trade issues, tax issues as they affect rural America. So we kind of go deep on these issues that are important to rural America and therefore very important to Nebraska. We've had the good fortune of working with a lot of Nebraska clients through the years, and again, it's just a real pleasure. I think one of the greatest things I enjoy in Washington, D.C., that I'm sure a lot of your listeners and watchers have been to in the past, is the Nebraska breakfast every Wednesday in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill, where your legislators sit together and just talk through the issues with the citizens of Nebraska. So it's really neat, and I hope we can do some of that today. I really just wanted to kick off with a little overview, kind of go broad, because I would say this. I think our U.S. agricultural industry is an incredible blessing to this nation. And we are incredibly well positioned to get our nation through this current crisis that is the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's my contention, and I want to support that this way and provide a little perspective for that. We as a nation have always had a very deliberate agricultural policy from our beginnings, right? So we settled this new world, and even as our founding fathers were speaking of revolution and then fighting that revolution for the sake of their property rights and their sovereign interests, and then as they were crafting our new governing structure, they were extraordinarily beholden to their belief that a successful agricultural enterprise in this nation was key to our success. And so they placed a massive emphasis on, one, private property rights, so that common people could own land in a way that they never had in the history of the world prior to that. There's a great quote that I love from our founding father, our first president, George Washington. He said, "It will not be doubted that with reference either to individual or national welfare, agriculture is of primary importance. In proportion as nations advance in population and other circumstances of maturity, this truth becomes more apparent and renders the cultivations of the soil more and more an object of public patronage. What he and Jefferson and really all the founding fathers knew was that by getting citizens rooted to the land, they would then build communities. They'd build their churches and their hospitals and take care of one another and become involved citizens in their government. Of course, at that time, virtually everyone was involved in agriculture in some way. These days, in 2020, in modern America, agriculture is held in very few hands across our nation. So we are now a nation of 330 million people. And if you count all the farmers in our nation, there are only just over 2 million, 2.02 million. So that's well less than 1% of our population. And if you break down that 2 million farmers, really of that, only less than 200,000 of those are what we would consider full-time farmers, the farm families throughout Nebraska that actually, put food on the table, that are producing the product. And I have some stats, so I can talk through that. But the point here is we've changed as a nation from a very agrarian society to a society that leads the world in economic activity, in creation of new inventions and things that are making our society better. But I think we can trace that back to getting the fundamentals right. Having an agricultural system that produces on a consistent basis so that we don't really have to fear shortages in the food store. And I think I hope if there's one silver lining, to this whole COVID-19 pandemic situation, I hope more people appreciate just how dynamic and how efficient and how extraordinary this U.S. agricultural system is. I mentioned the Washington quote. There's another quote from our current Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, who was a former Georgia governor. And he talks about an old proverb that says, if a man has not enough to eat, he has one problem. If he has enough to eat, he has many, many problems. Because of agriculture innovation and increased technology, we as Americans have enjoyed a great bounty of harvest. I think that maxim is absolutely true. We want people to, oftentimes in ag policy, we kind of lament that people don't really know where their food comes from. But the flip side of that is, isn't it a great thing to live in a nation where we don't really have to worry on a normal day-to-day basis about where our food comes from? Because it's there and it's plentiful and it's incredibly inexpensive. We as a nation spend 6.4% of our disposable income on food. That's the lowest of any nation in the history of the world. And right now, even in this pandemic, even though we're all nervous and there are some massive supply chain disruptions that we'll talk about, we still have it amazingly good, right? When all of us go to the grocery store, there may be less there than what we may be accustomed to, but we still are a land of plenty. So I just wanted to, I hope that's helpful to the listeners, just because we have had this deliberate policy through the years, and it's taken many forms from Homestead Act kind of land giveaways to get people actually out into the country, states like Nebraska, rooted to the land. Of course, we've had like the land grant, the Memorial Land Grant Colleges Act that funded great institutions like the University of Nebraska, and other great universities throughout the land that now we associate maybe more with football and the great extracurricular activities that we get to do, but they were started as extension systems to get knowledge out into the country to help make sure that our agricultural systems were going to be on the cutting edge. And then to the farm programs that we've really had since the Depression that are meant to help support farmers, which is where it all kind of starts. Even in current situations like COVID-19, the real tragedy of this for farm families is that a lot of the risk associated throughout the supply chain falls back to the producer. So you can imagine it's incredibly frustrating if you're a beef producer and you have to sell your product to enhance its value to a meat packer. And of course, the meat packers are having massive problems right now in this COVID-19 outbreak. What that does is it limits the demand market on your side where you're selling. So that results in lower prices to the producer. It also limits the supply on the grocery side, which raises the price for the consumer. Even as producers are having to pay more for the beef, the producer is getting less. And that's a classic economic problem for producers in this land. And it's why we have agricultural policy. You can tell I like quotes, so here's another one for you. John F. Kennedy used to say the farmer is the only player in the economy who buys retail, sells wholesale, and pays the freight both ways. That is a truth, and it's an economic reality that our farmers have to deal with, and it's why we've had policy to try and stand by them, even in times like this. So the last few years have been brutal for farmers. Prior to COVID-19, we had a trade war. Prior to that, we just had an economic slump that really brought down commodity prices in a significant way. I think Jay is going to have some charts in the next presentation that'll show the decline in prices really over the last 7-year period in a very vivid way. But now we are really at the farm gate facing a massive and very real crisis. Due to low prices, we've lost a lot of equity in the farm sector. The debt to asset ratios are ticking up in a way that's very alarming and concerning. And just, I guess most importantly, these farm families are looking at the prospect. Of course, they're planning, or they're largely planted now, but they're looking at the prospect of a loss on this crop. Farmers have a unique situation. They get payday at harvest. That's what they're going for. And it's tough to plant a crop when you know that based on current price projections, it's going to be a loss. You're going to lose equity. So you look to the federal government to try and stand by and help out. That's been done in the last couple of years in extraordinary. That is done on a regular basis through our farm bill. It's been done in an extraordinary way over the last couple of years during this trade war with China through a program called MFP. But right now, everyone is looking at this question of what's going to be there for 2020. It's really daunting. It's a really scary situation for these farmers who are, in addition to that economic uncertainty, they're being asked to go out there and do their job as they normally would, even amidst this pandemic and the human health concern. So it's tough times on the farm. We're sympathetic to the plight and obviously trying to make sure that farmers are being treated as well as we can by the federal government in this time when they've been deemed critical industry infrastructure and being asked to go out there and do their job as they always do. Obviously, there's a lot of things going with the CARES Act. I'm sure we can get into any of those more detailed questions. But I hope all the listeners will just appreciate what these, couple 100,000 farm families across this nation do for us every day. We should thank them every time we eat. Certainly thank the Lord for his provision, but also take time to thank a farmer, because they really are critical components of this really incredible society we know in the great grand old US of A. So I'm going to stop there, Adam. I hope that was helpful, and I'm just really eager to hear what questions and thoughts your listeners have today. Thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Well, thank you, Tom. And I think we will have some questions. I'm going to start one just from myself. You had mentioned the crossover there with the ag economy and the CARES Act. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, so the CARES Act obviously passed a couple $1 trillion bill, trillion with a T, a little over a month ago. And in that bill, in addition to kind of the tax rebates or tax credits that everyone gets at $1,200 and the PPP programs that have been very, incredible subscription early on by businesses and business owners. In addition to all that, the Congress did provide $23.5 billion through what's called the CCC, the Commodity Credit Corporation, and then in direct assistance for agricultural producers. Not just traditional row crops like corn and beans and wheat and sorghum, things that you see throughout the state of Nebraska, but also for livestock, who have traditionally not been supported in a big way by the federal government because there's more flexibility in the marketing of that crop. But livestock, dairy, and specialty crops, the fruits and vegetables, and those types of products. So $23.5 billion. Secretary Perdue actually came out with initial plans on that about 3.5 weeks ago, standing up what he's called the CFAP, the COVID Food Assistance Program. And that is meant to provide some direct assistance to those producers, the livestock, the dairy, the specialty crop and row crop producers. And they divided up that $16 billion. We're still waiting on the details of that. They're supposed to release some more details by the end of this week. And Secretary Perdue is committed to payments or the help going out, hopefully by the end of May. So that's a pretty tight time frame at this point. They're going to have to really get it going. And then in addition to that, there was $3 billion that was set aside for food purchases. Including that is like this harvest box idea that Secretary Perdue has had to try and get, food banks are typically great at non-perishable goods, food banks throughout the U.S. What's really interesting about this new program is they're trying to put in these harvest boxes meats, dairy products, and fresh fruit and vegetables. So more refrigerated type products to do a quick delivery. And this could really be a groundbreaking event for our federal government and the way it relates to food banks. So there's some interesting things going on there, but again, $3 billion set aside to try and remove excess product from the market and get it into the hands and onto the tables of hungry people across the U.S.
Well, thanks for that information, Tom. The CARES Act, of course, is a huge historic piece of legislation with a number of parts to it. And so it's good to have that info. I know a lot of people had asked us in previous weeks what components had been in the bill, in the law rather, as it relates to agri. So thank you for that. Folks, Tom is going to stay with us throughout the balance of the program, but we're going to move now to Jay Rempe, Senior Economist, Nebraska Farm Bureau. He's going to provide some insights into the local picture. Of course, there's going to be questions and answers throughout the program. So if you'd like to direct questions to Tom, you're more than welcome, and we'll get them to them as we continue. Jay, why don't you take it away with a local picture?
All right. Thanks, Adam. Thanks very much. And thanks to Sarah and Adam and Nicole and the Platte Institute for the opportunity to be with you this morning. I really appreciate it. Talk a little bit about something near and dear to my heart, Nebraska agriculture. I think Tom did an outstanding job of outlining from a national point of view, the federal point of view, overview of kind of what agriculture is going through right now, just like a lot of different sectors in the economy. And what I'm going to try to do, I think, real briefly, is just kind of step through some Nebraska specific numbers and look at how we see some of these things happening at the national level impacting Nebraska and talk about that a little bit. Just the way background, I am with Nebraska Farm Bureau Federation. I'm an economist for the organization. We are the state's largest general farm organization. We have roughly maybe 15 to 20,000 farmer members that are part of our organization that we represent their interests both in Lincoln and Washington, D.C. I am a reformed lobbyist. I've worked for the organization for 25 years and spent most of the time in the lobbying field, and they finally kicked me out of that and turned me over to something where I could get in less trouble. So we'll see. If I can work this technology right, I think I will share my screen with you in just a bit. So hopefully you can see my screen there. Adam, you'll let me know if there's a problem. But so what I want to talk real quick is kind of set the stage, like Tom said, on kind of the status of agriculture going into the COVID-19, and then talk a little bit about the impacts of COVID-19 and then what the future might hold. And as a good economist, we love our charts and graphs. So we get giddy when we see charts and graphs. So I'm going to be sharing a lot with you, but I'm going to try to run through this pretty quickly. First, kind of set the stage for Nebraska agriculture. There was a study that was done by the University of Nebraska a few years back that showed that roughly about a quarter of the state's economy is connected to agriculture in some way, shape, or form, that about a quarter of the state's output comes from agriculture. That includes production agriculture, but it includes the processing sectors and the input sectors. What I've got on the screen now just shows a little bit about the production agriculture. These are the farmers and ranchers on the ground. These are the ones that are starting the process, if you will. Generally in the state, we'll run between $20 to $23 billion of total ag receipts in the state, year in and year out. That's dominated by three primary commodities in the state: cattle and calves, the beef sector, corn, soybeans. Together, those three typically will make up almost 90% of the total ag receipts in the state. And that's not to slight some of the other crops, the wheat, the sugar beets, sorghum, pork, and some of the other commodities that are out there. It's just, if you want to look at how Nebraska ag economy is performing, you look to these three commodities. In terms of total acres in production, we generally have about 19 million. About half of that will be irrigated. We're the largest irrigated state in the nation. And then you can see the numbers on the livestock side there. If you look at that cattle number, the cattle outnumber us here in Nebraska more than 2 to 1. And so we're a big beef state, if you will, in that regard. Not only do we like to eat our hamburger steak, but we like to produce it as well. So let's take a look at what kind of things were like going into this pandemic. This charts Nebraska net income from the year 2000. This comes from the USDA Economic Research Service, the data through 2018. They haven't put out data yet for 2019 or 20. So those are forecasts that have been made by the Bureau of Business Research here in Nebraska. You can see that we were between 2000 and 2009-10, we were slowly climbing upwards. And then we hit that extraordinary period of time where we had a confluence of a lot of events in agriculture that created some remarkable years in the way of income. And you can see we spiked over $7 billion in net farm income for a couple times those years. Since then, though, as Tom explained, we've seen commodity prices drop. We've seen things change quite a bit. And between 2014 and 2017, we saw income in the state drop by 69%. And when I've talked to other groups, I've equated that to, if you imagine, if you're on a salary, if you walked in one day and your supervisor said, we're going to cut your salary in half. And so that's what farmers and ranchers have been dealing with and trying to adjust to that over the last few years. And then you complicate that with the trade issue that Tom mentioned and some of the others, and it's been a rough go for the last few years. You can see it a little bit of an uptick in 18-19, and that was largely due to the MFP payments that Tom mentioned, that the trade disruption payments that agriculture received in the state. You can see the forecast for this year is off, and that's actually off about 23%. So it's no surprise, income goes down, things get a little tough, there's a financial squeeze on, and we're seeing farm bankruptcies go up. You can see we had some really low years during the good times of 2012, 2013, and 2014, but since then, they're starting to creep back up, and some of the other ratios and measurements that we look at are also showing signs of increasing financial stress. And so the problem has largely been one of working capital, of cash flow, of trying to keep the operation going. And I say that because farmers are increasingly turning to debt to finance their operations. Fortunately, land values have hung in there. They're not going down tremendously, and they're staying about level. So that offers some equity on the balance sheet to give the farmers a little more capacity to borrow. And so this plots out the ag land values over the last 49 years. We kind of look at that as a way to measure the solvency or the health of the sector for the long term. And so for the long term, there's still some basis of support, some basis of hope, because we're seeing those land values stay there. You can see over time that typically land values in Nebraska will rise. In 34 years out of the 49, land values were up. But when at times when they go down, they really go down, like in the middle 80s. But this is a positive spot right now, is land values. And some people ask, why are land values staying up when income is down so much? Well, I think it's a couple things. There's not a lot of land going onto the market, so it's a pretty thin market right now. Plus the low interest rates, I think, help keep some folks interested and active in purchasing land. So that kind of sets the stage of where we're at. Now we hit the COVID, and this just adds some numbers to what Tom described in terms of what we've seen in the commodity markets. This chart plots price changes since the beginning of the year for some of the major commodities in the United States. It's the futures price. It's not the cash price on the ground that farmers are receiving, but it's emblematic of that. And you can see all across the board, we've seen declines in the commodity prices, some pretty substantial. The hogs, 53%, ethanol is off 33%, the ethanol plants receive, cattle, corn, soybeans, all across the board off quite a bit. This is due both to the demand shocks that we've seen that have been described, plus some of the supply issues that we've seen too as well. The ethanol in particular, with the stay-at-home orders and people not traveling as much, they're not consuming as much gasoline, so that's off quite a bit. Plus the oil fight that Russia and Saudi Arabia got involved in contributed to drop in oil prices, and you see that in ethanol as well. So this is what farmers and ranchers are looking at in the way of potentially lost revenues. And as Tom mentioned, a lot of farmers are going into the fields this spring planting, and they're looking at a loss right now. I've heard reports of $75 to $100 an acre in losses unless something turns around and changes in the near future. So to get a little feel of what that might mean for Nebraska, I took some of the national numbers that we've seen, particularly from the National Cattlemen's Association and National Pork Producers, applied those to Nebraska's industry, and came up with some potential losses. And this was reflective of the price drops that we've seen since January through early April. And they're not meant to be a projection of what we're going to see, because there's a lot of time for the rest of the year. We'll see how the economy responds. But they're just meant to provide a magnitude of the potential losses that might be there. So you can see cattle and pork potentially off close to $1 billion combined. Corn and soybeans, those are my own numbers, making some assumptions about production in Nebraska this year, some of the price drops and storage and carryover, over $1 billion there. The wheat's the one bright spot. Wheat prices have hung in there because people have been running to the stores and buying flour and other food staples like pasta, and so wheat's hanging in there. But overall, in the production sector, at least potentially a $2 billion loss, and that doesn't include the dairy sector, sorghum, sugar beets, and some of the others. So we're looking potentially at a loss in total ag receipts in the state of about 10%. That's pretty similar to some other estimates I've seen nationwide of 10 to 14% of lost receipts. Also, we have some of the related industries that are being impacted by this. You can see our ethanol industry. We have the second largest ethanol industry in the country. We have 25 plants right now. I've been told that 11 of those are down and not running. 2 are running at reduced capacity. And so overall, we're about 41% capacity. If you look at, I looked at 2017 sales of ethanol and distillers grains and applied that 41% to it, you're looking at potentially almost a $3 billion loss in sales there. And then we have the whole issue around the animal processing and what's happening in that sector. Of course, we've got the workforce and the labor issues and the health issues there. And as a result of those, the plants are struggling to remain open. And when they are open, they are operating at reduced capacity because of the labor issue. And so right now, depending on what the week and the day, it looks like we're running about 60 to 70% of capacity in the packing industry. And Nebraska's kind of, as you probably are aware from the news media, Nebraska is kind of the target or the epicenter of that because of our packing industry in the state. We employ, I think it's around 22,000 people in the packing industry in this state. And so that's why we're kind of the focal point of some of these problems that are rising their heads this year. So I'll talk a little bit more about that to describe why it's occurring real quick. The graph that you see there, or the drawing illustration, it comes from Purdue University, and it kind of describes the bottleneck that we find ourselves in the animal processing industry. At the top, you have the farms that are supplying the packing facilities, and then you have the packing facilities in the middle. And then at the bottom, you have the retail end, or the restaurants and the other consumers of that product. So what we've seen is the packing industry in this country is consolidated. It's built large facilities. They're very efficient facilities. And in normal times, everything works great, and we get good, affordable meats going out to consumers at a good price, and producers can capture some of that as well because of the efficiencies in the system. But this year, not only did we have COVID, but coming in, we had some other issues. We had a large number of animals on stock coming into this year, so we needed these plants to be operating at capacity. It's a just-in-time system, so once an animal is born, there's a time clock that starts that it's going to work its way through the process, and any hiccups in that can cause a lot of problems. And then, as Tom described, we had the shocks to the system. We had the shutdown of the restaurant hospitality sector. We saw grocery store sales double overnight. Those are two completely different supply chains, and so packers and distributors not only were trying to keep the plants running, but they were trying to reconfigure their supply chains to meet the changing demand. And so all of that just created this huge bottleneck, and that's why we're seeing shortages on the retail stores, and we're seeing animals, farmers trying to figure out what to do with their animals, and unfortunately some animals euthanized because there's nowhere to go for them right now. And this just a couple of graphs to show how much it's off. You can see this is the cattle slaughter rates through last week. Compared to the year prior, they're down 32%. And the blue line is 2020 slaughter. You can see we were running well ahead of last year going into this. And that's again because of the record animal numbers we saw, and they were trying to keep up and keep everything flowing. And this is the hog slaughter as well. So again, a dramatic drop off from last year. I think hopefully we've seen the bottom of that. Hopefully we've got it stabilized now, and we can work our way through the system. It's just a matter of how long it's going to last and how long it's going to take to work through this bottleneck. And so unfortunately that's again, Nebraska is the epicenter of that, and that's causing a lot of problems all across the supply chain, from the producers all the way up to the consumers and the retailers and distributors. So what's the remainder of the year look like real quick? Obviously, it's contingent upon how long this situation lasts. Will the restaurant food industry, will that pick back up again? How soon will people return to normal and driving their cars and purchasing fuel? All those questions are out there, and it's very uncertain, as you know. International trade is another cog for us. About 30% of our farm income comes from international trade. Obviously, we have the phase 1 agreement with China. That's big for soybeans and pork. So far, their purchases have been lagging. Hopefully, this COVID situation worldwide won't impact that too much, and that they'll return and start purchasing. If we can get things back to normal, there's a huge pent-up of demand in beef and pork in Asia that we could get to. And then finally, Tom mentioned the financial assistance programs, the CARES and farm programs. Those are going to be key, I think, for getting farmers to help them weather the storm this year. So with that, that is it. I'd be happy, along with Tom, to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions. This first one, I think, is really targeted at Jay. Is COVID been a bigger negative impact or just impact in general on our agricultural sector than the floods that we experienced last year?
Yeah, great question. When we first started talking about this, we were comparing this a little bit to the flood situation, but as this went on, we realized this was bigger than the flood situation, because the flood situation was more confined to a geographic area where obviously this impacts the entire state, and so there's a lot bigger impact from it. Yes.
Thank you. And this is probably going to be targeted at both Jay and Tom. So can you discuss the opportunities and the risks to farmers from the meat plants? And you've both touched on that already. But are there other bottlenecks that farmers are reporting other than the one that you mentioned there, Jay? And are there any thoughts on remedial policy to address this?
Okay, I'll take a crack first, and then Tom, jump in.
Deal.
There are some other bottlenecks. It was interesting when this first started. One of the primary concerns we heard from farmers was they were just about ready to begin their planting season, so they were worried about inputs and supplies into the planting process, whether it be seed, fuel, fertilizer, and that. The packing issue and that was kind of further from our mind, but obviously as things progressed, that rose and became front center. The other area where is the dairy processing side of things, and people have heard the stories about dumping milk. And my understanding is that's primarily due, again, we had this institutional demand through schools and others that demanded a lot of milk, and all of a sudden when all the schools shut down that consumption and that demand, and the processors and the dairy industry weren't ready for that. It happened almost overnight, and so that's one of the other areas that have seen some of those challenges.
I might just add, and Jay, that was a great answer. Tagging on the comparison between last year's floods and this year's COVID-19, one great thing in federal ag policy, we have policies that are designed to address things like massive flooding. In fact, the federal crop insurance program is really an amazing success. And so roughly 19 million acres of land across the nation, but really primarily focused in eastern Nebraska, western Iowa, South Dakota, received what are called preventive planning insurance indemnities based on what folks had planned in the past. So we really have some remarkable programs that are kind of built for situations like that to help the farmer and to stand by the farmer. This COVID-19 and the supply chain disruptions are a totally different animal or ball game. The choke points that Jay described are right on. Dairy has been a real tragedy. And I want to just, it is such a sad thing when milk has to be dumped, but I hope all the listeners understand it's just the challenge when you're a dairy operator is you have to go somewhere with that milk and you have to milk the cows again or they'll get sick and potentially die. So the cows are kind of that, they're your business and you've got to take care of those cows. And to do that, you've got to milk them 2 times a day and you have to have some place to go with that milk. And so when the bottlers, when the cheese manufacturers, when the butter manufacturers shut down or reduce what they'll take in, there's just no place to go with that milk. It's a tragedy. And certainly the dairy industry is working, and that's where these food boxes from USDA will come into play, just to try to give more places to go with that milk, because everyone realizes the shame it is when you have to waste food in that way. Hogs are kind of the same. Hogs are go to the processing plant at a specific weight, and they grow fast, and so if you miss that window, that's where you have to put those hogs down. So thankfully things are being done to try and address both those situations and others that are appearing in this food system.
All right, and I have a question from one of our state senators. With the current disruptions in our processing chain, why is the U.S. still importing beef?
That's a great question. There was a video that I think went viral, at least in the ag communities, a couple weeks ago, asking this question. I think some beef had been imported from Tanzania, I believe, as I recall. And I think that was largely for a niche market. We as a nation are a net exporter of beef in a significant way. But there are always little niche markets, and I think that was overplayed. But the situation for beef producers right now is awful. I saw a question come over the chat of, will there be any relief on the price side for beef? I think the economic information that Jay put out, showing that bottleneck, also just showing the slaughter capacity, tells the story of why prices are so low at the producer level. That's a shame, but that is where Secretary Perdue, with this CFAP program, has set aside $5.1 billion just to try and come in alongside the beef producer and make up for a portion of what's lost in that marketplace. In fact, Speaker Pelosi in the House yesterday introduced a new kind of a phase 4 package called the HEROES Act. And in that, it has some really interesting ag provisions where Colin Peterson, the chairman of the House Ag Committee, included provisions that basically say we're gonna make up for the loss up to 85% of the losses from this year's COVID-induced market losses to beef producers as well as dairy and others. So there is help on the way, but obviously we've got some steps to get over to actually get it in the producer's pocket.
Yeah, and if I could comment just real quick on the import thing, one of the things that is happening, our beef consumption in the United States is a multi-dimensional, dynamic, complex marketplace, and so there's a lot of different demands for a lot of different types of product across the spectrum, from the restaurant, hospitality industry all the way to the consumer level. And we've over time, we've developed a system to try to meet that demand in an efficient way possible, but to do it in a way that brings the greatest value to our producers. And I say that because a lot of what we import is a low value product. It's a lean beef grind product that comes in from Australia, New Zealand, and other countries. And it's ground into our ground beef then that is consumed in the country. That allows us then to export and sell higher value cuts to other countries, but also through our restaurant industry in the state. So in sum, if you were to shut off the imports into the country, you would be doing a disservice to the producers out there, because then they would receive less value for the product.
Okay, and go ahead, Adam.
Well, I had a question from a policymaker. They would want to know from you, Jay, I think. Could you give us a sense of what the landscape now looks like on the property tax issue? Obviously, budgetary issues are of major concern at the state legislature. Local communities are having their revenue sources threatened. What does it look like from an ag producer standpoint and ag land owner standpoint when we look at the property tax issue in Nebraska?
Well, obviously, when you've seen the suggestions that we're going to have farm income, or the projections are that farm income is going to drop 23% this year, and so I guess from an ag farmer standpoint, rancher standpoint, it just makes it more acute, the problem and the need to try to do something. I'm not close enough in the political circles to know exactly what all the discussions are going on, but I understand there are still a lot of discussions around property tax relief and business incentives and that, and I certainly hope that something can be done, because I think this just points, property tax is one of those things that are outside of the farmer and rancher's control. And when they see their income dropping by over 20%, it just makes that property tax bill, it just highlights it, I guess, in their minds, and shows how something needs to be done.
Thank you, Jay. Sarah, did you have a question coming up? I think we might have lost Sarah there. I know
we got it.
Go ahead. Yeah.
So we've been getting some questions, and I'm going to read it to you guys, and feel free to answer it. So, with the proposed 3014 legislation or the 5014 legislation, will that result in higher prices for cattle producers? And does Congress have any appetite to pass a federal mandate for more cash negotiated trade? And I'm going to apologize. You're probably going to have to explain what that question is and then answer the question.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Jay, were you going to jump in here?
Well, you go ahead first. And you know more about Congress than I do. So.
Yeah, and I don't know the 3014, 5014 references. But there is a lot of concern about, obviously, the consolidation in the meat packing industry. We have very few players there. We have limited capacity at the smaller meat processors throughout the land. I don't think, so I saw one question come up on the Q&A of, should we build new plants, bigger plants? I think we have enough capacity, and we don't want overcapacity. Obviously, that would be inefficient and wasteful. And these are expensive. These are massively expensive plants. So we have plenty of capacity. It's just right now we have this unique acute problem that's related to COVID-19 and being able to get workers on the floor to process the meat for whatever reason, because they've had an outbreak or because they're scared. You can imagine as an employer how difficult that is. You know, even President Trump has used the Defense Production Act to say that slaughter plants have to the extent they can, remain open and keep processing the meat. That's all an attempt. It's all an attempt to move more meat through there and improve prices. But I think everyone is of the belief right now that we just can't get there. The market can't self-correct fast enough, and you can't mandate higher prices be paid or anything like that. And that's where Secretary Perdue is looking to construct his at least $5.1 billion plan to come alongside the beef market, and a similar plan for hog producers. One very controversial part of that came out 3 or 4 weeks ago was the pay limit associated with this at $125,000. You know, a lot of hog producers can lose that much in a day when they have to euthanize their pigs. So we hope and we trust in the second when they put out additional information this week, that the program will be constructed in a way that it just addresses a significant portion. Like I said, 85% is what's in the House bill of the losses associated with the COVID-induced market free fall. So I hope that's helpful. But there is a bigger problem here that Congress has really wrestled with for many, many years about the bargaining power between producers and the consolidated slaughter industry, and it's a really challenging problem.
Okay, we have another question on hog producers. Trying to understand the potential government support for losses. Are they euthanizing market hogs to participate and continue selling below market value to avoid euthanizing and burying animals? And Senator Grassley mentioned something about FEMA addressing this. So I guess that's a Jay and Tom question on that.
Yeah, I'll take the first part and then let Tom talk about the FEMA part. The reason that you're seeing more euthanization, I guess, on the hog production side, and we've seen a little bit on the poultry production side of things. Again, the whole system was designed around just in time. So the moment that little piglet drops on the ground, there's a clock that starts ticking and starts timing. And hogs different in cattle in that they're raised in buildings. And so farmers are doing their best to try to put as many animals in those buildings as safe as possible as they can. There's some animal welfare concerns and obviously employee concerns if you get too many animals in a building. But at some point, if you can't take those animals to the facility for slaughter, unfortunately, they don't have a choice. And so you're seeing both. We're hearing more euthanization on the smaller pig side just because it's a little easier to catch them early in the system. But there are some market hogs being euthanized as well. And that's primarily due it's completely due. It's not really a marketing decision at all. There's a market for that product. It's just that they don't have anywhere to go with them.
I'd just add on the help from the federal government side. They've been wrestling with this too. Secretary Perdue, USDA has certain authorities to help with any time a herd or a hen house or whatever it is has to be quarantined for whatever animal health reason. But Secretary Perdue has struggled with that legal authority when it comes to this human health crisis that's caused supply chain disruptions and backups. So in this bill that was introduced in Congress yesterday, the HEROES Act, Chairman Colin Peterson from the House side actually clarifies that the authorities that the Secretary has can be used to indemnify producers for those lost animals or lost milk in the case of dairy. So there is those legal changes are in the works, and I feel confident that they will be done in the next few weeks. In the meantime, you do have obviously Secretary trying to provide technical assistance. You know, there's an environmental issue here. There's all kinds of issues that you have to deal with when you're talking about euthanizing pigs and where to go with them. So FEMA and the USDA are providing technical assistance on that side, but the financial help is still in the works.
So we just got a question about regulations. And so we've got the bottleneck problem at the slaughtering locations. Is there something that could be remedied regarding regulations? And so is it constructing a new plant? Is there a regulatory change that the state of Nebraska could address? I know Wyoming just passed a law allowing individual farmers to sell to the public. Or is this a congressional act? Is it the USDA regulations that are holding us back? And so I know that's a question targeted at both of you all.
Let me talk a little bit about locally. There's a lot of interest in that, obviously, right now. There's a lot of discussion about that. And there's also some bigger picture discussion about some of the shortcomings of the current system we have, and is there a need to build some resiliency or some redundancy a little bit. But I know there's a lot of discussion at state level about some kind of a state meat inspection program. Other states have a state meat inspection program. My understanding, and Tom can jump in on this, but my understanding is those inspection programs have to meet the USDA standards in order to be viable. And Nebraska, we've talked in the past 20 years, a couple different times about starting one. And whenever we've gotten to the point where we're almost passing legislation, the costs and the staffing and the like involved always threw a wrench in things. And so I anticipate a lot of discussion around that kind of an idea, or those ideas here over the coming next legislative session, or even maybe, who knows, maybe at this legislative session.
Yeah, Jay answered it exactly right. You know, in DC, we roll things off of our tongue like, you know, Americans enjoy the safest, most reliable, most consistent, most affordable, and most diverse food supply in the history of mankind. It sounds great, and it's absolutely true. The safest is a big portion of that. So we have, as a nation, have always tried to have policies that promote the safest food supply possible. And in fact, on meats, you know, they have to go through a federally inspected processing plant, or a state can have a state inspection process for sales within the state, and even interstate if you meet certain compliance guidelines, which are basically you meet the federal standards. So there are some hoops to jump through to get to that place. I'm not exactly familiar with what Wyoming did if they tried to supersede all that and just allow for direct sales of uninspected meat. That'd be a challenge, but the reality is none of these, even that, won't have a significant blip on the cattle markets. We've got to get through this COVID thing, and we've got to stand by. And this is where Secretary Perdue is so focused on standing by those cattle and hog producers in the meantime until this market regulates out.
All right, and changing gears a little bit over to corn. So we have a question from a policymaker. Does a $1.2 billion drop in corn consider the difference in basis? Cash price is down about $1 a bushel.
Yeah, great question. I should have pointed that out. It does. For that portion of my estimates, I looked at actual Nebraska cash prices and took into account the basis. And yeah, I know we've seen, and the basis is the difference between the futures market and the local grain elevators bid. That's called the basis, and it has widened considerably here in Nebraska, primarily because of the ethanol situation.
I might just mention on the ethanol situation, and Jay, I didn't know Nebraska was the second largest. But in this package that was released last night, this HEROES Act, the ethanol industry has been struggling with this, you know, ask for additional federal assistance in addition to the mandate and things. And in this HEROES Act that was introduced last night, again, Colin Peterson from Minnesota, they did include a provision that basically said we're going to help offset some of the costs to ethanol plants of their corn. So we're going to give them 45 cents for every gallon of ethanol produced between January 1 and May of this year. And if they had to shut down, they're going to give them 50% of that value based on what they produced last year. So included in this package, again, not law yet, only introduced in the House, still subject to negotiation with the Senate, and has to be signed by the President in our very wonderful but inefficient system of governance. But this provision is in there to provide some real help to the ethanol plants. And hopefully, as people begin driving again, and I think this is the belief, ethanol kind of works on a just-in-time system, just like meat and dairy. And so hopefully when people start driving again, we'll have to crank up all these plants again to meet the demand from increased gasoline usage.
And let me add one more. I see a question here about the future of the ethanol industry over the next 10 or 20 years. And while we're talking ethanol, I'll jump in on that real quick. But I hope what Tom says is correct, that we'll get people back out and traveling again, and we'll see a ramp up of production. I do think I know at least here in Nebraska, there were some plants that were really struggling even going into this. And so I would be surprised if they came back on. But watching the ethanol industry over the next 10 to 20 years, obviously we're seeing this movement from fossil fuels and looking at other energy sources for transportation, electricity, and other natural gas and the like. So I think that's a big question, is where does the ethanol industry turn, and how does it design its future? Because if you look at the future projections, gasoline consumption is going to continue downward on a slow trend down. And so we're going to have to figure that out somehow.
So we got another question. A lot of people are concerned that this might be the first time in history or a significant time in history where Nebraska agriculture is in serious trouble. And so one person is asking, you showed that farm bankruptcies were at 38 in 2019. Is that trending higher for 2020? And then given the destruction of our demand and supply chain and the huge buildup of surpluses, and then 2020 being an election year, what are the policies that are going to be put in place to support 2021 and beyond to ensure Nebraska ag producers are insulated? And I know that's a big question, so I'm sorry about that.
Well, maybe I'll try to tackle the first part, and then Tom can talk a little bit about the policies. Oh, it was the bankruptcies, and so great question. And new numbers just came out on bankruptcies, and I have not. Over the last 12-month period from March 31st to March 31st, they were up, but I haven't looked at how they compared to last year at this time to make that comparison. So that's something we'll be looking into and seeing what we can do.
Yeah, I'd just add, and it's a great question. And this is what we're struggling with every day. And thanks to Mike for asking it. The economic outlook for agriculture across the board is terrible. And in a lot of years, maybe corn will be bad, but the livestock side is good. And so farmers can kind of manage their risk in that way. We always have a farm bill that is designed to provide some support, but really, in the last two farm bills, so it was rewritten in 2014, and about $23 billion was taken out of the farm bill to fund other priorities. And then it was rewritten in 2019 as a baseline farm bill, no increases. So, and I think the basic belief is if we're just relying on ARC or PLC, they're not going to do the trick. They are just absolutely not going to do the trick. They aren't going to provide the sufficient level of support our farmers need. That's why President Trump has done these MFP payments the last 2 years. And where I think you're really going to see Congress going in the next few weeks is having a broader discussion of what needs to be built back into the farm bill to provide an adequate safety net, just to get farmers through until the time when the market is providing more reasonable and better returns. There's no way to manipulate that through prices, but what we've done as a matter of federal policy is we've said, farmers, please go out there and keep doing what you're doing, because kind of like that quote from Secretary Perdue said, if we don't have adequate commodities, then we'll all have one major problem, we would rather, the problems associated with oversupply and having to stand by our producers in the meantime are a lot better than the problems that would be associated with undersupply. So that's kind of the framework which Congress comes to this. They're talking about an injection of an increase to the CCC authority of up to $68 billion, an injection of another $30 to $50 billion into the ag economy for 2020. I wish it were there already, because I know that farmers are having to plan and they're looking down the barrel of what is just a very depressing ag outlook right now. So Congress needs to move quickly, and we're trying to push them to move quickly to give farmers something to bank on, and to battle through this just very depressing economic outlook. They can't move fast enough, honestly, and we're going to keep pushing in that way.
All right, well, we have one last question, and this too comes from a policymaker, and you may want to just combine your answer with maybe any closing thoughts that either of you guys have for today's presentation. But with the large increase in the federal debt, with trillions in COVID relief, what are the long-term ramifications for agriculture? That's
a great question.
Yeah.
Can I take it first, Jay, and then let you wrap up as the Husker?
Yeah.
The federal budget deficit is a real concern. So we annually take in as a nation somewhere north of $3 trillion in tax revenue. For the last several years, we've been spending well over that. We've been averaging about $1 trillion deficit, so spending somewhere north of $4 trillion. We've already added about $3 trillion to that this year. So they're currently projecting a $4.5 trillion deficit for FY20. So that deficit, $4.5 trillion, is far greater than even our one-year annual revenue. We're more than doubling our spending. Agriculture annually spends about 1/4% of our federal budget, 1/4%. So for every $100 in taxes paid, one shiny quarter would go to support all the ag programs, crop insurance, the farm bill programs, the conservation programs that are so important. So we've long made this case that that's an incredible, that what that does provide a little anchor of stability to the ag sector, achieves an incredible return on investment for our society by having this incredibly dynamic agricultural and food supply system. And I believe that, and that's why we fight with passion for it in Washington, D.C. Will agricultural programs be under increasing scrutiny going forward? Absolutely. And so we're going to have to up our game. The Farm Bureau is a great voice, incredible voice for agriculture. We as advocates and lobbyists in Washington, D.C. will be working with all the grassroots organizations, and we're going to have to mount a defense. Part of that is because we live in a democratic society where there just aren't many of us. Nebraska has 2 great senators, big fans of Sass and Fisher, has 3 great members of Congress, and Smith and Bacon and our chairman of Ag Approach, Jeff Fortenberry. So, you have incredible resources in DC, but that's 5 out of 535. We need more like them. And that's a challenge for ag, where we all have to come together and kind of across regions and across sectors fight for one another's interests, because we do believe that even with this additional spending that we're going to do this year, again, small in comparison, a lot of money for ag, but small in comparison to 3 to 5 trillion in additional spending of COVID relief generally for the economy. And we believe it's just critically important for that very reason. Just to repeat it, if we don't get our ag policy right, if we don't continue to have you guys as producers, as farm families, taking a risk every year to sow that seed and produce food for our nation and for our world, we'll have a lot bigger problems than COVID-19. So let me just conclude by saying thank you, farmers, ranchers throughout the state of Nebraska and Iowa and in South Dakota, and all the listeners who might be tuning in today. Thank you for what you do, and we're going to work to stand by you.
And I can't really add more. I think Tom's exactly right. In couple things first came to mind in looking at the federal government debt, and obviously interest rates are concerned given the debt levels that farmers are carrying right now. So to the extent that at some point in time that federal debt becomes burdensome and we see interest rates start to rise, that would be of concern. And then ultimately, as that we've been able to carry that debt as a country because our economy has been growing, and it's just similar to a family. You can carry debt as long as your income and you can pay that debt and your family income is growing. The country's the same way. Now that we have the setback, it's a little concerning as how far we can carry this and still be fiscally sound and move forward. And when that period comes, the squeeze on farm programs and other programs, crop insurance and others that are vital to our industry, that's the big concern there too. And so it'll be one we'll be watching closely. And I echo Tom's comments on the importance of agriculture and the job our farmers and ranchers do. In my 25 plus years in working in agriculture, I've been incredibly amazed at the resiliency of our farmers and ranchers, and they've gone through some tough times. They won't come through this unscathed, but they'll make it through and emerge on the other side and continue to providing the food that we need and consume.
Well, Tom, Jay, thank you very much for joining us as our guests. We're getting a lot of great comments from people in the comment section. We appreciate all of those who have asked questions today. Thanks to the Platte Institute team for helping me with this program. I want to thank you all for attending and let you know next week we are going to be having another Platte Institute webinar on regulatory reform, post-pandemic licensing and regulatory reform, which you can register for now at platteinstitute.org/webinar. The registration page there is live, and we're doing something a little different today. If you would like to give us feedback about our program, we would love to have that so we can continue to improve the Platte Institute webinar. Just go ahead and join us when you sign out. There'll be a little survey that comes up. We would really like to have your information, and better late than never, there's the information about the webinar that's going to be held next week on Wednesday, May 20th, same date and time as this program. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Platte Institute webinar. Have a great day, everyone.